At this point, we're turning our attention to the Southern writer Flannery O'Connor, who is one of the authors that we're looking at in this course. Flannery O'Connor, as we've already anticipated, is a writer from the American South. Her life was fairly brief. She was born in 1925 and passed away in 1964. O'Connor was born in Savannah, Georgia, but she later moved to Milledgeville, Georgia, and she had a home in town in Milledgeville, but also she and her family moved to a farm. You might call it a farmstead. The reason that's significant is because it seems to provide the setting for a lot of her stories. At least she draws a lot of the images, and certainly her understanding of rural life, her understanding of farm life. And for the most part, all of her stories are set in these rural situations, farm situations, dealing with dairy cow farms, beef cow farms, pig farms, that sort of thing. O'Connor died much too early. She died at the age of 39 of the disease of lupus erythematosus, and her father had died of the same disease at the age of 41. So during the really entire tenure of her writing career, she knew that her days were numbered, and that only lasted for about 12 years. It's impossible to imagine with accuracy exactly what that would be like to have that experience, to know that on the one hand, you had a vocation you took very seriously to write. On the other hand, knowing that vocation was going to be short-lived, that there would not be much time to carry that out. So we can at least imagine that would give a certain kind of focus to her work, a certain kind of seriousness to her work. So her corpus is relatively small. There were 2 novels. The first one's entitled Wise Blood. The second is entitled The Violent Shall Bear It Away. And then she had 2 collections of short stories. The first, A Good Man is Hard to Find, and that's the name of one of the stories in the collection. And then the second collection of stories was published posthumously. It is entitled Everything That Rises Must Converge, and again, there's a story with that title. The title comes from the Catholic theologian and philosopher Teilhard de Chardin. And O'Connor, this is a good opportunity to note that O'Connor had wide and deep interest. Her education was not a spectacular education. That is, she didn't go to the top university. She didn't have the opportunity to pursue a doctorate. She didn't live in those sort of intellectual milieus. She got an undergraduate degree at Georgia College, which is located in Milledgeville. She had mixed feelings about the education. I think she was looking for something a little bit deeper and richer in the liberal arts, as are a lot of students these days who even go to some of the better universities. And then she got a master's at the University of Iowa in creative writing. After that, she began her career. She lived for a while in the Northeast, but when she began to fall ill, she returned to Georgia, and that's where she did her writing. So what are the characteristics of her work, and what's the source of her fame? Because first of all, she's numbered among a group of Southern writers called, in the genre called Southern Gothic. Now, she resisted the term Gothic. She thought that was too confining, too provincial. She preferred to use the word grotesque to describe her work. But she was part of, however you look at it, this group of writers that included William Faulkner, who certainly the most prominent of those writers, Carson McCullers, Eudora Welty, and you could add Walker Percy to that as well. So again, this group is sometimes designated by the term Southern Gothic writers. The characteristics of her writing that are most conspicuous, well, we should say one more thing about her fame. While at times she was compared with other Southern writers, she was also compared with the Czechoslovakian writer Franz Kafka because of the techniques and styles that she employed. She also was famously compared in one description. Description was by Thomas Merton, and he said, I really would compare her to Sophocles. That is a Greek tragedian because of the insight that she has into human nature, the insight she has into the human tragedy, the understanding she has of human psychology, and the way she's able to blend philosophy, theology, literature, her art. So one of the characteristics of her writing then is this grotesque technique. And what we mean by that is that her characters tend to be distorted. Sometimes it's described as her characters are described as cartoon-like. Now, if you spent much time in the Deep South, and by the Deep South, we're talking geographically about the states beginning with Texas, running over to Louisiana and Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, Tennessee, Florida. That would be one designation of the Deep South. If you've spent some time in some of those locales, especially some of the rural areas, then you might think these don't seem to be caricatures of people. These seem to me to be pretty accurate portrayals. And there's something to be said for that. At the same time, there is a distortion, there's an exaggeration, there's a cartoon-like quality to her work. And so that's important to keep in mind. And we're going to talk a little bit more about why she employs that. O'Connor is also a very economical writer. What do we mean by that? What we mean is that every word counts. There are no wasted words. She was a slow writer by her own admission. She labored over every sentence. She labored over every paragraph, every word, and it shows. There's a real artistry. There's a genius. For example, to her use of the metaphor, her ability to reproduce dialects and conversations, and her ability to capture important principles and ideas just with a description of a gesture or a phrase, just a remark. Another characteristic of her writing, so if use of distortion, the grotesque is one characteristic, the economy of her writing is another characteristic. We should add that, and this is one of the conspicuous things about her writing, and it even puts some people off. Some people have a hard time dealing with this aspect of her writing, a hard time digesting it, but her writing tends to be very violent. There are a lot of people who are killed or maimed, often in violent ways, and children are not excluded from that kind of violence. Again, we want to ask the question, as we ask the question especially about her use of the grotesque, why does she use that sort of technique? Let me give a quick answer to that, and then we'll be able to explore it a bit more through the stories that we are reading. In terms of her use of the grotesque, one reason she uses that is simply because she wants to get our attention. It's part of her art. She has a very famous explanation of her writing in which she says, to the almost blind, you have to write in large and startling letters, and to the almost deaf, you have to shout. So both the grotesqueness and the violence that she uses in her work are meant in part to get our attention, because she says some of the subjects she's dealing with are things that people might think they understand, but they really don't. And so bitter medicine is needed to get her point across. And then in terms of her use of violence, one of the important themes in O'Connor's work is she thinks that she knows that we are in need of self-knowledge. We need to understand ourselves as we are. But it's very hard for us to acquire that kind of information. Human nature resists that kind of insight into ourselves. For that reason, we are in need of grace. She talks about divine grace, she talks about natural grace, but we are in need of this thing called grace. It's a force, it's a favor that we receive. It's something that helps us to rise above our humanity, our flesh and blood. Something that intervenes in our life and gives us the kind of self-knowledge that we need. And because we are so resistant to it, that grace often has to come in violent forms. Do we really need that kind of violence in order to acquire that kind of self-knowledge? Maybe. But maybe not as often as we see it portrayed in her stories. Once again, keep in mind that she's using a literary technique in that. One other point about the grotesqueness before we bring this particular session to a conclusion. Another reason that she uses the grotesque with her characters and with her personalities is because, as she explains in several different ways, we share in that grotesqueness. That is to say, there is some of that distortion, some of that freakishness in all of us, and we need all the help that we can get in order to see that, in order to understand it. And we need to be able to distinguish between what is grotesque and what is normal. And another oft-quoted phrase, O'Connor said, "I'm asked why Southern writers write about freaks as much as we do." And she said, it's because we can still recognize one. At least in the South, we can still recognize one. And in order to recognize the freak, we need to be able to understand what normality looks like as well.